So let's start with taking a look back at 2021, the year that almost was. The first thing to note is that hours worked on the most recent data. We'll be getting more data over the next month. So this is still not quite end of year data, but hours worked in construction are still below the pre-COVID level. If you take a look at this graph at the table at the bottom on the left-hand side, you can see the average hours worked in construction for 3 months, August, September, October. And you can see that in 2018 and 2019, they were over 20 million. Not surprisingly, they dropped in 2020. The return in 2021 has not yet reached the pre-COVID level. Now that may change as the final data comes in this year, but so far the hours worked are lagging behind the pre-COVID level. Now, what's distinctive about that as a pattern or a trend is that usually when you see a decline in hours, you attribute it to a decline in demand and consequently to unemployment that flows from a decline in demand. That is absolutely not the story this time. What we'll see when we look at some more data is that, in fact, it's a supply side issue, not a demand side issue that we're looking at. One way to parse the labor force is by age groups. And when we get to construction workers, the sample size is not that large. And so we can only use 3 age groups here, but they still tell us, I think, a pretty important story. The first is that the common media story that you often encounter about labor supply issues is that young workers don't want to come back to work. They prefer to stay on if they were had access to the CERB benefits or its successor or to the extended UI benefits. They prefer to stay on those benefits rather than return to full-time employment. And that story may ring true in the low-wage industries, like pardon me, like construction and retail. It is absolutely not the case in construction. If you compare the August to October numbers for 2019 to the same numbers this year, 2021, what you find is that among the young worker cohort, those who are age 15 to 24, there's been an increase of 16% in the number that are working. That's a very significant increase over a couple of years. By contrast, there's been a decline in the age group 25 to 54. And we suspect that that decline is more evident in the older age group than in the younger age group. And then when we look at those who are 55 and over, there's a very marked decline, 17% decline, in the number of those workers in that age group who are now working in the construction industry. So one of the effects of COVID appears to have been to foster reluctance on the part of many older workers to return to their traditional construction job. They may be working on own account work, doing residential renovation work or that sort of thing, but they're not returning, at least a good number of them, are not returning to traditional construction jobs. Overall, we're seeing what looks like a decline of around 5% in the size of the construction workforce, and that's significant. When you look at the unemployment rate, The unemployment rate now is actually below what it was before COVID. Not dramatically below, but it is below what it was before COVID. You can see the area that I've circled here, which is the most recent unemployment rates. And then you go over to the year before COVID, and the unemployment rates were actually somewhat higher. Another indicator that Statistics Canada tracks is job vacancies. And compared to 2019, the number of job vacancies in construction has increased by 31.6%, which is a very significant increase in job vacancies, jobs that contractors are having difficulty filling. When you look at capacity utilization, this is for the manufacturing sector, it is somewhat below the pre-COVID level. It's running around 77% or so, when it was about 79% or so just before COVID. Of course, it dropped to just slightly under 55% at the height of the lockdowns. Now, historically, there have been two benchmarks that we look at for capacity utilization, 70% and 80%. When capacity utilization hits 80%, then manufacturing firms generally have pricing power, and you will feel that. And that often triggers decisions to expand capacity, to invest in new capacity. And when capacity utilization falls below 70%, that usually implies that firms do not have pricing power, and it actually sometimes triggers shutdowns of capacity. Now, prior to COVID, we were approaching 80%, which means we were approaching a point where firms had pricing power and may very well have invested in new capacity. What has happened with COVID is that it has upended those traditional benchmarks. They don't mean the same thing that they used to. The utilization today is not constrained by demand, it's constrained by supply challenges, difficulty getting the inputs for the manufacturing process. And so consequently, the pricing power has already kicked in. And we see that, and we'll discuss it a little more in this presentation, but we certainly see it in a number of areas. And the heart of this is supply chain woes. And the supply chain problems are at their most acute in any products or components that are shipped by sea. And that's especially true of the China trade, but equally true of the European trade. And probably the best indicator of supply chain woes is the backlog of ships literally sitting at anchor in the bay, or just tooting around the Atlantic or the Pacific because they can't be unloaded. In construction, the impact of those supply chain delays is primarily on the trades where imported components play an important role, and that would be especially the electrical and the mechanical trades. The supply chain problem is not so acute, but there is still evidence of it, but it's not so acute for building materials that are domestically manufactured, which is ready mix, aggregates, concrete block, and bricks. There are some limitations in the trucking industry, and so there are some supply chain issues there, but they're not as acute as with anything that relies on maritime trade. And just to sort of give you a sense of the visual impact of that, the port of Los Angeles and the one just south of it in Long Beach accounts for roughly 40% of the imports into North America. Normally, there would be 6 to 8 vessels at anchor, waiting for an opportunity to go dockside and be unloaded. This summer, the number of vessels at anchor was over 60. And then, in fact, because the bay was getting so crowded, to avoid risk of accident, you had ships just tootling around in the Pacific, literally waiting for an opportunity to get to the bay so they could anchor in the bay. And not surprisingly, the impact of all of that was to dramatically increase shipping costs. And so in the autumn of this year, container shipping rates were roughly 400% higher than they were before COVID. Let me turn to monetary policy because it has an important role in the outlook for 2022. And the aspects of monetary policy that we need to pay attention to are the low bank rate, which in turn affects interest rates elsewhere in the economy, the quantitative easing. And quantitative easing consists of the Bank of Canada purchasing bonds for the most part, usually from banks, sometimes from investment houses. And so the result of that is that if it's a bank, it has sold its bonds, it now has cash on its ledger. You can't do anything with cash except because it doesn't earn money. So the banks, when they have increased reserves as a result of the quantitative easing, look for outlets to lend that money. And also the bank has been purchasing corporate bonds. And as you bid up the price of a bond, the effective yield on that bond goes down so that interest rates are lower. The impact on bank balance sheets of increasing their cash reserves and therefore forcing them to look for outlets for lending has been especially significant in real estate because given the CMHC policy of insuring mortgages. Now, in some new housing now, the price of housing has exceeded the mortgage, the threshold for insurance. But for banks, lending in the mortgage market is extremely attractive because of the CMHC guarantee, and additionally, they have very sophisticated actuarial metrics for assessing credit risk in the mortgage market if they're lending on an uninsured basis. And so not surprisingly, since the start of the COVID lockdown, if we compare today to March of 2020, the chartered banks have increased the total volume of their residential mortgage lending by 24%. So there's a direct link between the monetary policy of quantitative easing, the low bank rate, therefore the low interest rate, and the dramatic expansion of mortgage lending. And you'll see over here on the graph that of course is a graph of the 5-year fixed rate mortgage. Those are the rate hub estimate of the actual negotiated rates rather than the posted rates, which are often somewhat higher. So let's look at what the inflation recipe is. You take low interest rates, you add to that a plentiful supply of credit, you add to that labor shortages, you add to that supply chain disruptions, you stir the mix together, and you get inflation. And it's useful to look at inflation in terms of the stages that it seems to be going through. And the first stage of inflation is asset prices. And the asset prices that are most visible to us are housing prices and the stock market. And since the advent of low interest rates and quantitative easing, we've seen a marked increase in asset price inflation. The Toronto Real Estate Board's MLS average listing for the GTA is up by 41% since the fall of 2019. The Toronto Stock Exchange, the Standard & Poor index is up by 27%. The second stage that we saw in the process of inflation focused on building materials. And as an approximate indicator of inflation in building materials, we look at the producer price index, which is basically the ex-factory gate price that manufacturers charge. Now, many contractors, of course, are not buying from the manufacturer, they're buying from a distributor. And so there's additional markup and management of supply as a result of that intermediation. But we've certainly seen significant price inflation or price spikes in building materials, some building materials, over the last year and a half. That was most evident in lumber, which was coming down and which is now spiking up again. Structural steel, absolutely. Even brick and related has gone up. Glass has certainly gone up. Ready mix, not so much. Drywall has come down. And if we were to go through the list to many other products, copper wiring, copper pipe, similar examples of significant price spikes. The third stage in inflation seems to be when inflation then works its way through to consumer prices, which is what you and I feel and what your employees will be experiencing. And when you look at the consumer price index, you can see that that's the graph there on the upper left. You can see that this is the headline all items consumer price index. You can see that prior to COVID, it was reasonably stable. Then we have the lockdowns starting in March of 2020. Prices actually dropped. Then they recovered to basically where they were. They were stable again for a couple of months. And then in the autumn of 2020, they started to creep up. And then beginning this year, the pace of increase, the pace at which consumer prices increased also picked up, and it ratcheted significantly. When you look over at the graph on the right, that compares the consumer price index in, say, the month of January of 2021 to the month of January in 2020. And you can see that the rate of increase there was only 1.4%, sorry, 1.0%. And then you see that the year over year rate of increase trended upwards and upwards fairly sharply till its most recently spike, and there'll be another report coming out in another week or so, was 4.7%. The fourth phase of inflation, which we do not yet appear to have entered, and it's not clear whether we will. Time will tell, and we will certainly know, I think, within about 6 months, is whether there's a spike in wages in response to the increase in prices. We're not seeing a lot of evidence of that wage increase just yet, but that should be no indication of what we are going to see in the coming year. It's unclear what the wage response will be to rising prices. So we're not seeing a generalized wage inflation in either the construction industry right now or in the economy overall, but there are some canaries in the mine that are beginning to chirp, suggesting that we may see wage inflation over the course of the coming year. There is a statistical series that Statistics Canada has started to produce. The sample size is not huge, and so the data is not entirely reliable. What they do is they survey job vacancies and the offered wage to fill those job vacancies. And in the construction industry, the offered wage compared to the beginning of 2020 has gone up by 10.9%. So that's an indication that there's probably some wage responsiveness already to both the shortages and probably also to increasing consumer prices. And then COVID, the great uncertainty. The graph on the left here tracks the seven-day moving average of COVID cases. And you can see that after the peak in the third wave and the vaccination campaign got underway in all seriousness, that brought the infection rate down considerably. We had the Delta wave, which was really quite suppressed in Ontario by the vaccination campaign, and now we have Omicron, and we don't know what's going to happen there. We do know that there will probably be a need for a booster shot campaign to control the Omicron virus. So the Omicron virus, the Omicron variation, rather may be the same story as Delta, which is to say not a big story, largely an issue with the unvaccinated, or it may penetrate the vaccination shield and become a much more serious problem to manage. We simply don't know where we're going on that one. So summarizing 2021, total hours in construction are still below the COVID level, the pre-COVID level. The decline in skilled labor supply in the construction industry is around 5%. And that has resulted in systemic labor shortage pretty much in all trades and all sectors. That is compounded in many trades by supply chain disruptions, especially those trades that are reliant on importing components that arrive through maritime shipping. We are certainly in an inflationary process. We've seen the first stage of asset price inflation, the second stage of building materials price spikes, the third stage when consumer prices accelerate. We don't know whether we're going to enter the fourth stage which is characterized by wage inflation. And lastly, of course, the Omicron variant to COVID puts a question mark over any forecast. So with those caveats, what's the outlook for 2022? First of all, on a province-wide basis, the provincial outlook for construction is very positive. There will be growth in every region and every sector, and that's going to put increased pressure on labor supply and also on the supply of building materials. In real terms, we're looking at growth in the construction industry on an all sectors basis of just slightly under 2% in 2022, rising to 2.3% in 2023, and then dropping back to 1.4% in 2024 and 0.6% in 2025. These are the projections from BuildForce, the stakeholder-based sector council. They're in the process of revising this outlook. They'll be producing a new outlook for release, I believe, in early January. The numbers will not be significantly different from the story that I'm telling you here. I say that because our firm provides the technical support for the BuildForce model. The GTA outlook is actually even stronger than the province-wide outlook. Again, all sectors will be increasing, and you will see growth in each and every year, and it will be fairly strong growth as well. So the pressure on the labor supply in the GTA is going to be particularly acute, and it will be aggravated by an expectation that COVID and the restrictions are going to reduce some of the interregional, interprovincial migration that you might otherwise see to address labor shortages in the GTA. If we look at the housing sector, again, this is the build force projections. We see an expected increase in starts in 2020 and in 2021 compared to the pre-COVID level. By 2021, we'll be pretty much back to where we were in 2018. If you look at the CMHC outlook for confirmation, it basically tells us the same story, that there was a sharp decline in 2019. We started to see recovery in 2020, and their forecast for the next 3 years would have us, they set out their forecast as a high-low range, but basically would have us back to where we were or above where we were in 2018. If we take a look at building permit data to see what kind of signals that is giving us, and building permits basically tell us what's likely to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. So just to review, and many of you are familiar with the process, a developer first puts in an application for site plan approval. That can take, depending on the municipality, that can take anywhere from a year to 2 or 3 years to get to get site plan approval. And then usually as you're approaching the end of the process for getting site plan approval, the developer will put in the application for building permit, which is permission to build. And by that point, the developer has invested in the land, invested in all of the studies necessary to get site plan approval, done the complete designs necessary to get approval from the building department. So the developer has sunk a fair bit of money into this project. Building permit is not a guarantee that construction will proceed, but it's a pretty strong indicator that construction is likely to proceed. And what you can see on this graph is that permits declined somewhat and were, relatively stable throughout most of 2020. And then in 2021, there was a fairly marked increase in permits issued, dropped off a little in the fall of this year, but the implication from the building permit trend is that low-rise starts are going to increase in 2022, and that increase will carry over certainly into 2023. When we translate that into the demand for employment and output in the masonry sector, the outlook essentially carries over. And what we've done here is divide that outlook for both residential and the non-residential component of that demand. And what you can see is that there will be an increase in demand, roughly 1 to 2% over the period up to 2023, 2024, and probably continuing even into 2026. By the time you're in 2025, 2026, the forecast is less reliable, but certainly for the medium term, unless there are disruptions in the supply chains or the Omicron variant proves to be much more virulent, what we're looking at is a steady increase in demand and in employment in the masonry sector, and that of course is going to put some pressure on labor supply as well. An important factor to take into account, and it's a strategic one here, is that what we're seeing in terms of building codes or municipal supplements to building codes, for example, Toronto's Green Building Standard, is a marked discontent with the use of the overuse of glazing for cladding high-rise buildings, be they condos or office buildings, but chiefly condos at this stage. And the building code, in the case of Toronto, the Green Building Standard, the code provision refers to the window to wall ratio. And on current projects, the window to wall ratio is roughly 85%. Sometimes it's actually closer to 95%. And what is happening with those requirements in Toronto is that they're being reduced to 40%. So that produces a fairly significant change in the cladding requirements for new high-rise construction. Now, the developers responded to this by getting their applications in before these requirements kicked in. So there's a large pool of development projects which, for timing reasons, will be constructed under the old rules rather than the new rules. But the new rules will be kicking in. They will have an impact. They will change the cladding design for high rises. And historically, what has happened is that Toronto and its Green Building Standard have led the way, and then the Ontario Building Code essentially picks up on that somewhat later. So this is likely to be a regulatory change that you see diffused across the province over the course of the next few years. Now, a shift to a 40% window to wall ratio does not guarantee a market for masonry because there are other cladding strategies, but it does, for the first time in 20 years, create a strategic opportunity for masonry in the high-rise sector. And so it's an opening for you that strategically you may be able to advantage yourself. And that completes the presentation. Happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, John. Can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, you can. Okay, perfect. Fantastic. So I can open it up to questions here. I'm just wondering if someone has a question. I guess Conroy can bring over the microphone to whoever, if there's any questions out there. I can also kick it off while we wait. I know that the labor issue is certainly something that we are talking about, particularly within our sector. We're seeing pretty steep growth projections, and that combined with probably some stimulus coming through for infrastructure. How do you anticipate all of this stuff getting built with the backdrop of the labor shortage that we're experiencing?
Yes, we are economic advisors on market capacity to Infrastructure Ontario. So we're well aware of their infrastructure spending plans. There is mobility between for construction laborers. There's mobility between the civil sector and some of the trades, masonry being one of them, in that a worker can move from civil sector to being a mason's tenderer in the ICI sector. They obviously can't move to being a mason without additional training. But there is some mobility here. What I think you're going to find is that because of the priority of the infrastructure projects, they will basically pay what they need to get them done. And that will shift the labor shortage burden onto other sectors. If I think back to a similar situation, it was when the major work was being done at the Pearson Airport. And the airport, the project company there was basically able to offer the better part of 10 years of steady employment to anyone in the trades who was working on the airport. So they didn't have a shortage problem, but other people did. So I think what you're going to see is that the massive infrastructure builds that are underway are probably not going to be impeded by labor shortages, but they will transfer that shortage pressure onto other sectors that will scramble.
Right, and I guess that in turn leads us into another issue that we're having in terms of housing affordability, right? So there's obviously a push from the province to cut red tape. They established a panel yesterday to look at housing affordability, and there's a big forum coming up on the 16th of December with the labor shortages that are taking place.
Yeah, I mean, we can build about maybe 40,000 units a year. The industry does not really have a capacity to go much beyond that. So I don't actually read the problem as being that much of a supply problem. Pardon me. The essence of the problem is that housing has been turned into an investable financial asset on steroids. After all, downtown, 2/3 of the purchasers of condos are investors, not residents. Outside of the downtown, it's roughly 1/3 are investors. Housing has always been a financial asset, but it's now a financial asset on steroids. And so it is basically exhibiting the same asset price inflation that we've seen in almost every other asset class. Frankly, the solution to rising housing prices is to roll back the quantitative easing and let the interest rates increase. Ultimately that's going to happen, but the Bank of Canada is going to be very cautious about doing that until it knows that the recovery is on solid legs.
Right.
But right now, if you were to reduce the approval process requirements for constructing housing, you would certainly get through the site plan approval process faster. You might get through the building permit process faster, but I don't think you would be able to build more than 40,000 units a year.
Hey, John, I just had a question.
Turn it on.
Oh,
Is it on? There's a button on it.
hey, John. No?
Sorry, we got one question just on the other side of the.
Oh, I got it. No? Agree? Okay. Just wondering, I know one of the main drivers of the economy as well has always been immigration, and obviously with COVID, that's been a huge challenge, but it drives the economy on a number of levels. It helps with the labor force. Have you been seeing any accommodation from the government, obviously with the challenges for COVID, to see if we can get immigration back to pre-COVID levels, or even some accommodation for the fact that this doesn't look like it's ending anytime in the next?
First of all, it is a federal responsibility, and the answer is yes. The government is clearly conscious that immigration is important both on the supply side of the economy, but also on the demand side. That is especially true in the GTA. Immigration is unquestionably the major structural driver of the increase in the demand for housing. And immigration took a hit under COVID. Not surprising that occurred. The federal government is committed to making up the immigration deficit. That is to say, the immigrants that were lost or that didn't come to Canada in 2020 and also this past year. It will take a few years to make up that deficit. One way that they're accelerating, it doesn't have quite the same impact on the housing demand, but it does have an impact, is that they're easing the process by which young persons who are in Canada on a student visa or Canadian experience visa can transition into the permanent immigration channel. So they're certainly doing what they can to make up the deficit. They're aware of the significance of the deficit, but it will take a couple of years, certainly, to fully achieve that.
We got one more question coming here.
So there's a green, there's a button on it. Yeah, just take up mute.
To piggyback on Blake's comments with immigration, has the government looked at maybe ramping up efforts to encourage immigration of those with certain skills? Maybe help us out with that?
Yes. So the federal government established quite some time ago what was called a provincial nominee program, which took the immigration system and said to the provinces, we'll still handle the processing of the applications, but you can designate certain occupations or nominate certain individuals for essentially accelerated and preferential treatment in the immigration system. That was originally focused on provinces that were getting a low share of immigration. So you saw that it was used widely in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and to some extent in Atlantic Canada. It's now being used to address the shortage of skilled labor in the trades, because of course the point system that we use under the Federal Skilled Worker Program disadvantages applicants with a trades background compared to applicants with a post-secondary background. Ontario is using its expanded rights under the provincial nominee program to address shortages in the skilled trades. So the answer to your question is yes, they're aware of the problem. Yes, they're trying to use the immigration system to address it. It's still too early to say how effective that will be.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So
sorry, Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was. You want to repeat that? Sorry, I put it on.
yeah, pardon the pun, but I know you mentioned it's too early to tell. Any ideas when we may see some fruits of that labor as far as getting more immigrants out to the workforce?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Yeah, so the question is, any idea as to when we may see the fruits of the labor, the efforts to get more immigrants into the workforce?
The challenge that and this is anecdotal, so the traditional sources of skilled labor immigration for the trades had been Southern Europe. And the early evidence appears to be that source is close to being tapped out. Whereas Several years ago, governments in Southern Europe would in fact collaborate with Canadian recruiters to assist in finding eligible applicants for immigration. The message now is we need them. Go fish somewhere else. And so frankly, recruiters are looking for other pools to recruit from. And currently they're scouring the Caribbean and South America predominantly. How successful this will be remains to be seen. There's also a proposal that has gone forward from the Canadian building trades to expedite the processing of qualified skilled trades immigrants and to enable employer organizations and the building trades or some partnership of them to be sponsors for skilled trades immigrants as well.
I just have a follow-up to that. I was just curious about sort of temporary foreign worker programs, how that fits into the immigration piece. Is that something that you're accounting for with new labor? Because I think, we could be in a situation where we need labor now, not 3 to 5 years from now. So if you can speak to any temporary foreign worker program that may come into effect. I know in the farming you mentioned out west, they have different programs out there. Is there anything you see coming into Ontario in the short term?
Yeah, the temporary foreign worker program has been a means of relieving pressure in the labor market, predominantly for low-skilled workers. Usually assemblers and manufacturing, but to some degree in construction. I'm not optimistic about the temporary foreign worker program really providing a solution to the skilled labor needs in the construction industry. I think it can provide some relief for semi-skilled labor in some of the labor functions, say for the civil industry, civil sector. But I'm not confident that the temporary foreign worker program is really going to provide significant relief when the shortage is skilled labor and you're looking for somebody who has a trade. The program's not really designed to do that, and I don't think it would be very efficient at doing it, although I'm sure there will be folks who want to try and use that program, but I wouldn't. It's not a horse I would bet on.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions before we cut John loose this morning? All right, with that, John, I think that's all the questions. Thanks for sharing your insights with us. I know certainly the economy is always a hot topic, but I think certainly in the last 2 years, I've been noticing a lot more buzz terms flying around, and particularly with the supply chain issues that are taking place. I think it's certainly a talking point at all the Christmas parties that we're going to be attending. So certainly appreciate your time this morning, and I'll let you go.
Thank you very much. All the best. Best of the season.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.